Welcome to the audio presentation on Arts of Ritual and Daily Life. This is a fascinating topic because what we're going to do to begin with is we're going to look at how we define art and fine art and really consider how it's a relatively recent classification. Up until the 18th century, art was a more integral part of daily life, just another kind of artisanship. There was the sculptors and there was the potters, and they were relatively equivalent in the eyes of society. But in the 1700s, European philosophers made a separation between painting, sculpture, and architecture as separate from other kinds of skills. And they placed these together with poetry and music, and this all became a new category we call fine art. Now, this is a very young classification when you consider the history of humanity, although now it's 300 years later and it simply seems like the way things are. But it's really a cultural construct. So if you consider how fine art is sort of seen as, in some quarters is sort of hoity-toity, unnecessary, underwater basket weaving or whatever, it's good to understand that really it came along only about 300 years ago, and it really came along at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which changed so much about how we relate to made objects and to the world around us. Now, it's also interesting for the person who has an artistic temperament to remember that even though art isn't really as central in some ways to our society as it was 400 or 500 or 1,000 years ago, there's a lot of opportunities in the arts, and maybe the artist just has to consider themselves not quite at the center of society, but very important in society. On that note, one very positive change is that, say, back in the Middle Ages, artists never signed their work, and now the personality of the artist is important. So, to organize our exploration, and what we're going to do is move beyond this classification and explore art that was created before that separation was imposed, or what artists have done after the separation between craft and fine art was imposed. We're also going to explore how some aspects of art and society are continuing to challenge this whole classification. Now first, let's look at a variety of media that bridge the gulf between art and craft. Right now we're looking at a ceramic teapot by the artist Bill Lee, and it is a great example of a teapot. We'll see it's functional, but it's more has a purpose as a high art, as really fine art. As we look at the different media, we're going to talk first about clay. Now clay is also called ceramics, and ceramic is the art of making objects from clay. Clay is a naturally occurring earth substance. It's powdery when dry and then becomes plastic and moldable when wet. Once clay has been molded and allowed to dry, it'll hold its shape. But as you may know, it's very fragile. It's kind of chalky. But once you fire it, once it's fired in a kiln ranging from between 1200 and 2700 degrees, then it becomes strong. Now I know near my house there's clay deposits, so next to a creek you can see the beads of clay where the ancient people would have simply mined the clay and made their pots with it. We're going to look at some of the techniques that people use to create clay objects. Now the earliest known objects were from China over 20,000 years ago, and remnants from other parts of the world are almost as old. As you also know, we find pottery shards at Native American sites. So let's look at the techniques. Here we have slab pots, which are really just about what it sounds like. The artist rolls out the clay much as they would dough, and often they'll press an indentation into it to create a pattern. Then they join the pieces, and they use what we call slip or liquid clay to adhere the pieces together. Now let's look at the next kind of clay is coil clay. Now making a coil pot, maybe many of you have done this. I know I did when I was in grade school. They take the coils and then wrap them one around the other. You can find some examples of clay pots where you really see the coil. In other cases, like we see here, the artist is taking a tool and joining the coils together. In either case, again, the artist will need to use a slip in order to connect the clay and have it stay together during the firing process. Now, I'd like us to all look at the artist Maria Martinez, and she's profiled in your book. I'd like you all to look at the profile of this artist on page 265. Now, what she did was she was one of the primary artists who helped to bring the resurgence of interest in Southwest Native American pottery. And what you see here is how she has incised these designs onto the clay and then burnished it or rubbed it very smooth in some places and then gone and painted the slip, the liquid clay, in other places in order to create this pattern. It's amazing to consider that these actually started as as coil pots rather than something that's thrown on the wheel. Now let's look at the wheel, at the potter's wheel. The potter's wheel is ancient. It's probably one of the most widely used and quickest methods for creating a pot. As we know it today, this wheel was invented in China about 3000 BC. Now, many modern wheels have had electricity added, but the basic design remains the same. The artist puts a lump of clay on there, maybe some of you have done this, and then uses their hands as the clay spins to create a pot. Now, if you've tried this, you will probably know it, number one, takes a lot of strength, and also you have to have a centering technique. Like if you're throwing a pot like this, and maybe you have a little thought, or you get a little distracted, the whole thing can go wibbly and fall apart. But the good news is you can just make another pot. Now, they talk a little bit in your book about porcelain. This is a type of clay that's widely used in China, and it's a mixture of fine white clay mixed with what we call putinese or putense, and also known as porcelain stone. Once it is high fired, the porcelain pot is very strong and has a sort of a glassy, translucent feel. Often pots are fired twice, and the first time is the firing to get them to the original strength, and then the glaze is added and they are fired again. If you'd like to, I would like for you all to look in your book on, let's see, on page 267 at the finely painted antique porcelain Chinese vase. Well, here is an artist in modern times decorating a vase with glaze that has been fired once and will be fired again after the glaze is applied. All right, let's just move on from clay on into glass. Now, glass is a medium that fascinates a lot of people because it's so fun to watch it be made. I hope you've all watched the video on glass blowing in this week's assignments. There are numerous formulas used to make glass, but the primary ingredient is usually silica or sand. Other materials are added to affect color, the melting point, the strength, and other factors. Now, glass becomes pliable once it is heated to a high heat, but unlike clay, its chemical composition doesn't change once it's heated. Now, there's a fun legend as to how glass was discovered, and I like this legend, even if it might not be true. Okay, so there's a bunch of sailors, old Phoenician sailors, I don't know, probably 3000 BC, somewhere around that era, quite a while ago. They stop on a beach, a sandy beach, and they build a fire on the sand. They used blocks of something called nitrum, which is either potash or soda, sort of like bricks, to hold up their cooking pots. Now, as the nitrum gets hot, it melted and fused with the sand and made the first glass. Well, really, archaeological evidence suggests that it didn't really happen like that. It seems that the first glass was created a little bit further inland, in the area between eastern Syria and northern Iraq. Yet another example of how this part of the world, so much in turmoil today, has great historic significance for our cultural history. Uh, now, glass is typically blown, but it can also be cast. This is a cast piece from ancient Egypt, about 1500 BC. Now, the Egyptians, they were masters at working with glass. So let's talk about stained glass. That is such a fascinating topic. What this means is simply cutting glass in order to, of various colors into, you cut glass of various colors into small pieces and then fit it together to form a pattern. Now, this is a cathedral. It's from Name Cathedral, and it's a very famous use of stained glass. I invite you all to also look at modern stained glass masters. John Lafarge and Tiffany are two that are really worth looking up. Lafarge in particular, Lafarge, is a wonderful master of this medium. Now, stained glass used to be held together with lead, but often today they use a copper foil that isn't quite as strong, but is less toxic. And there's also reinforcements that were used in ancient or historic Gothic stained glass and are also used to this day. In fact, the first wide use of stained glass was by a guy named Abbot Suger. It looks like Abbot Sugar. That's how his name is spelled. And he wrote a treatise that if these churches, the Gothic cathedrals, were filled with light, that people would be inspired and they would then feel the Holy Spirit and be, become better worshipers. So he dedicated himself to making these very elaborate and beautiful churches, as well as beautiful objects for himself. And we're going to look at his cup when we talk about metal in a few slides forward. Oh, look, here's an example by John Lafarge. This is the artist that I was just talking about. Now, what he did that was so spectacular was look at that cloud sort of below the end, the tip of the angel's wings, and notice how there's a cloud with blue and orange and all these colors in it. You can also see that around the inscription. Well, Lafarge would actually fire this glass. He would create this glass and fire it in sheets in order to support his designs. And when you see an original Lafarge work of glass, then you see all these textures and patterns that are within the glass that really add to the piece. So next up, let's talk about metal. Metal is one of the most versatile of materials. Metal can be a fine piece of jewelry, or we could think about the metal for a bridge spanning a large river. Humans have fashioned art pieces from metal as long as they've been working with metal. What we're looking at here is apparently, I think it's beaten, so it's not cast, it's hit with a mallet in order to shape this piece. But it's a necklace from the tomb of who else but King Tut. So here's a King Tut artifact that's from ancient Egypt and is one example of metalworking. Since we talked about that quite a bit last chapter, we're going to breeze through metalworking and we'll look at the cup of Abbot Suger. This is the guy who wrote the treatise about light filling the churches, and he actually was responsible for he was the one who inspired a lot of the stained glass work that came in with the Gothic cathedrals. And you can notice the fine metalwork on this cup. In addition, there's a couple of great examples in your textbook on page 268. But let's move on. Let's talk about wood. Now, wood is interesting because it's the most common and versatile, and yet it's the most vulnerable in some ways of all that we've looked at. Maybe right up there with fiber. Because wood is vulnerable to heat, cold, moisture, and it can rot. It can just fade away. Now, furniture is one of the most common uses of wood. And here's a factoid I think is very interesting, that the first chair was created in 2700 BC in Egypt. So before then there wasn't a chair like this one, which is from around that time. This chair that has armrests that you can sit in. Before that time people had stools and there was large thrones, but they didn't have the simple chair. So what we'll do now is we're going to move on to part 2 of this audio presentation, and we're going to talk about another fabulous artist in woodworking.